was
Yeah, that's
talking about kosher yesterday. They used to deliver turkeys to the slaughterhouse in Dundee. They put them on a conveyor belt, and after they dead, somebody would cut them open, take the guts out. There'd be a veterinarian there checking the line.
Yeah.
We're talking about how our standards of kosher. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so just to conclude from, oh, sorry. Welcome back. Okay, klal ha'oila. So the rules that Rav Sharaga has derived, which, as I mentioned, some of them are a little bit more stringent than I think other poskim, is that Adam shehitfis, we'll just run through these 5 rules and then we'll go on. Adam shehitpis sefer b'shier latzmo hazuchliyot. If a person publishes a book and he reserves copyright, kol hazuchliyot shmurot lo ve'in reshut l'shum adam lahadpis lo reshut, then that is a legally binding stipulation upon the purchaser. No purchaser can say, when he buys a book that's or any intellectual property that's copyrighted, well, I paid for it, I can do with it what I want. No, that doesn't work that way. When you purchase something, you have to abide by the conditions of the seller. Number 2, v'hu adin likalatot shel divrei Torah o shira b'zimra she'aser lahatikan afilu litzarach atzmo. And the same thing applies to recordings of lectures or music, that you're not allowed to copy them, even for personal use. And that even for personal use is where we mentioned that other poskim do permit for personal use, because fair use law, Dina de Malchusa, essentially says that you are allowed to make copies of intellectual property for personal use. Okay, as long as it's not for resale. Number 3, and that's of course with the exception of licensing software, where they only want 1 copy of the software, and they have safeguards in to prevent you from copying the software, right? Even for personal use. So like if you want to use it, like you had mentioned, Doug, I think, that you have to put in the code and then you can't put it on another computer, where each computer that you have has to have its own license. And that's why sometimes, you'll buy a multi-platform licensing fee, because the company knows that you're going to be using it on multiple systems. He says sampling, that is taking small excerpts from a book or a recording, is permitted for personal use. Because since the owners of the intellectual property generally don't mind, then it's fine, unless the owner says in the opening of the book or in the caveat of when you purchase the recording, no sampling, even tiny snippets, may not be sampled from this intellectual property. In that case, then you have to respect that requirement as well, according to Rav Sharaga. Other poskim say that you don't have to, because of fair use law. Number 4, avol tochnot mechashev shekatuv shemochrim rak zuchut shimush osur lahatik mehem bichlal va'afilu chelek mimenu. Licensing software, as we mentioned, has a different category, and you cannot even take a small amount for personal use. Va'afilu adam sherachash mecherev tochna shlema bekesef maleh v'hu mishtamesh b'misrad v'rotze lahatik mimenu l'tzarach hamechashev b'bayit asur. And even just to take a piece of software that you have on your office and to transfer it to your home computer for personal use, that would also not be permitted if it's licensed and not sold outright. And so again, it all depends on the conditions of the seller, okay? And finally, number 5, aval im azlu sifrei hakodesh ubalei hazuchuyot lo madpisim. If, however, the book no longer is available and they're no longer printing and they're not in the process of reprinting, mutar litzalemu lahatik litzarach atzmo, then you will be allowed to print for personal use. Let's say get an old book that's out of print from the library, and then you can photocopy it if it's no longer in circulation and there's no plan for it to be reprinted. Okay? And certainly something that's part of the public domain also is no longer subject to copyright and intellectual property restrictions. Okay, so there's more to discuss. As I mentioned, there's another, and Rav Sharaga has another sefer where he expands on this idea. We may take a look at it at some later date. Let's start the new tshuva, which is lihishtamesh b'chayfetz b'li reshut kishayodea b'vadai shahabe'alim yaskim lo, which the next shaila is it permissible for me to borrow and use someone else's property when I know for sure that they don't mind? When I know for sure that they don't mind. We've visited this issue before. We talked about the permissibility of, let's say, going into someone's field and eating their fruit if you know that they welcome people to come in. Do you have to get their permission? So this is using someone's property without their permission, but you happen to know that the fellow doesn't mind. Midei pam yotze li lishtamesh b'chayfetz shel echad hachaverim shelo birshut. Occasionally, I use a friend's item without his permission. Aval ani batuach she'im hayiti mevakesh mimenu reshut hu haya marshe li b'simcha. I am absolutely certain that if I would ask him if I could borrow it, he would for sure give me permission. Can I borrow your pen? Or can I borrow, what's another example? Your safer. Can I borrow your, what else? Your lawnmower. Okay. Ha'im ze mutar. Is this permissible? So kasav maran b'shulchan aruch. Adam shelokeach b'she'ela chayfet shel chavero shelo midat ha'ba'alim nikra gazlan. The Shulchan Aruch writes that if a person takes an object that belongs to his friend without his friend's knowledge, that person is called the gazlan, a thief. V'zehu sha'amru sho'el shelo midas gazlan havi. The Gemara's very succinct statement is, when you borrow without permission, you're a gazlan. Ula'inyan. Imhu haya yodeya, she'imhu haya mevakesh mechavero reshut uvadai haya maskim lo lishtamesh b'simcha v'tuv levav. Well, what if you know that if you would ask your friend, he would certainly agree and he would be happy to let you use it. It's just that he's not here right now for you to ask him. Yesh lahaktim da hagemara misaperet bebava mitzia. That we should first introduce this topic by telling you a story from Bava Metzia. Ameimar umar zutra v'ravashi nizdamnu lepardes shalmari bar Isak. The Gemara relates the following. These three sages, Ameimar, Mar Zutra, and Ravashi, were invited to visit the orchard that belonged to a man named Mari bar Isak. Ba ha'aris v'lokach mehapardes Tamarim virimonim v'niach lifneihem. The sharecropper who was working in the field filled up a basket of dates and pomegranates and put the basket of fruit in front of them. Ameimar v'Ravashi achlu, umar zutra lo achal. Ameimar and Ravashi ate from the produce, and Mar Zutra did not eat. Kevin shuhu chashash legezel ki ulai. Well, Mari was not there. So the reason why Mar Zutra didn't eat is because he was concerned that maybe Mari bar Isak didn't know that the worker was harvesting produce for the sake of his guests and putting it in front of them. And so he was choshesh that maybe this was not given by the owner. Bintayim higia Mari bar Isak shuhaya ba'alim. Tam yoshvim le'echol. So all of a sudden, Mari shows up, and he sees the two rabbis sitting down and eating fruit. Amar la'ariso, and then he turns to his worker and he says, Loma lo heveta lachachamim mehaperot hayoter yafim. You should have brought them nicer fruit. So that's what he says. Says that to the worker. Now, does do you take him at face value? That he's upset that the worker only brought them the grade B produce and should have brought them grade A produce? Amru chachamim lamar zutra, hine ata roeh shebalabayit maskim mizeh shehu amar lama lo hiveta yoter yafot. So the two rabbis turned to Mar Zutra, who wasn't eating, and he said, "You see, we were justified because we see how happy the balabayas was that we're eating his fruit, to the point where he said you should have brought them even nicer ones. Why then are you still not having fruit?" Okay, Amar lahem Mar Zutra, the balabayas Amar Kain, rak machmat habusha. Aval ein mikan hochacha shehu maskim. It's because what? Maybe the balabayit just was embarrassed. He was put in this situation where his guests are eating his most expensive produce, and he was hoping, he's trying just to. Here you may have a situation where someone comes over to your home, and the housekeeper pulls out the most expensive liquor in the house, or the wife pulls out the most expensive liquor in the house. She has no idea. She doesn't know my liquor cabinet. She doesn't know what I spent on each bottle of scotch. And she just knows that when her husband's friends come over, they'd like to drink. She says, "My husband's not home. Let me bring out a bottle for you." And then she ends up bringing out this $800 bottle of whiskey. She doesn't know what it's worth. And so then all of a sudden, the husband comes home, and he's about to have a heart attack. They're drinking the bottle that I was saving for our anniversary, our 50th anniversary, or something. But he doesn't want to embarrass his wife. So he said, "Oh, you should have brought them out a nicer bottle." Right? So is he serious? Or is he just saying that to save face, because really he wishes the guys wouldn't have drunk at all? So that's the scenario that Mar Zutra is worrying about. Now, the Katfu Sham Hatosfus Masha Ravashi va'Ameimar Ochlu Hainu Mishum Shesamchu Shebishat HaChaluka He'aris Yagid LeBalabayit Shehu Lakach L'Tzorach HaOrchim So I'm not sure what the word lekazez means. That's a new word for me. He says Ravashi and Ameimar felt justified in eating because they assumed that the worker, the sharecropper, would have deducted that from his salary. And usually what a sharecropper does is that he works for a percentage of the yield. And they figured that the sharecropper would tell the balabayit, "I decided on my own to give these fellows some of the fruit, but if you're not happy, you can always deduct it from my share." So then it's, the kazez. Let me just see what that word means. It's an interesting word. Offset. That's what it means. They'll offset it. Okay. Umar Zutra chashash shemahu yishkach v'lo yodia lebalabayit v'lachein lo ochal. Mar Zutra's concern was maybe the worker would forget. He wouldn't tell the balabayit that he had taken some of this fruit for the guests, and maybe the balabayit wouldn't have wanted to have fed them from this produce. Now, the Gemara does also talk about, is there more expensive produce? In other words, if the balabayit, I hope he mentions that, if the balabayit says, "Oh, you should have given them the better stuff," well, is there indeed better stuff? Like, what if that's the most expensive bottle in the house? And a guy says to his wife, "Oh, you should have given them the better stuff," but there is no better stuff. She happened to take out the most expensive bottle. Then you know that he's not being sincere when he says that, right? But we'll get to that in a minute, hopefully. Aval ein lomar shemashahim achlu kavanatam haita lismoch shekesh Mari bar Isak yedami zevadai hu yaskim lamasha achlu meha perot. But Tosfos apparently doesn't believe that you could assume that the balabayit would want them to have that produce. It's only because they assumed that the sharecropper would have deducted it from his own if Murray didn't want to give them the fruit. Because since the Balabayit Murray did not know that they were going to be eating his produce, the Kaimelan lahalacha ka'abaya sheyeush shlomidas lo habiyeush. We paskin that for forsaking ownership unknowingly is not legal. In other words, just because if you would have known, you would have been moichel, doesn't mean that if you currently don't know, that constitutes mechila, that constitutes a relinquishing. Im kein muchach mehatosvus hanal sha'asr lihishtamish bechayfetz afilu im yodeya shavada yaskim. It turns out that according to Tosfos, even if you know that the owner is, once he discovers, would say, oh, that's fine. I didn't know you wanted to use it, but the fact that you borrowed it, no problem, totally fine. But it doesn't work retroactively according to Tosfos. If in fact I was not aware that you were using my item, then you've stolen it from me because I didn't have the cognizance, I didn't have the knowledge to say totally okay, even if I would have said totally okay. So it's interesting that the Makor Baruch also quotes from the Shulchan Aruch Harav, who seems to say the same thing. B'chein pasak b'Shulchan Aruch Harav is elashona. Va'afilu barur lo shekesheyivada liba'olav shehu natla azay yismechu v'yagilu mipnei ahavat hamoto. Even if it is clear as day, I know, because we're such good friends, that he would be happy that I helped myself to something in his home when I came to visit. That even though he didn't expressly offer me to help myself, but if he knows that I helped myself to something in his home, he'd be happy. Nonetheless, asr lo lehanos ba below das habom. You're not allowed to, without first getting permission, express permission from the balabayit. Lefichach hanichnas lapardes olaginas chavero, and therefore, when you come into your friend's orchard or garden, asr lo lilkot peros shalomi das habaolim. You're not allowed to start picking fruit off the trees without the owner's knowledge. Even though you may be best friends with the owner, and you know for a fact that he would be overjoyed that you've helped yourself to to some of his produce. Mikol makom kevin sha'achshav einu yodea mizeh. Nonetheless, benefiting from someone else's property without their knowledge is prohibited. And the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, you have to notify people. The Rav Shulchan Aruch, you all know who that is? He's the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Balatanya, the author of the Tanya. So he was a halachist as well. And he basically wrote the Rav Shulchan Aruch, which is a sort of a condensed version of the Shulchan Aruch with his gloss, right? It's referenced quite widely. And therefore he says you have to notify people because a lot of people are not aware of this halacha. Now, that's one perspective, okay? But we're not going to leave with just that one perspective. There's another way of looking at it. Aval hashach kosav. Dimlo haya mefached haya omer shebaofin kazeh sheyodea bevado shim balabais haya yodea haya vaday maskim mutter. He says the Shach disagrees with Tosfos. The Shach is of the opinion that if the owner, indeed not out of embarrassment, but genuinely would want his guests to help themselves to his property, and he would definitely have agreed, mutter, then it is permissible. V'zelo nikra yeyush shalom midas. And that's not called relinquishing ownership unknowingly. Ki b'yeyush shalom midas medubar shu lo yodeya eifa hachefetz ubal karcho hu mityayish. Yeyush, which is giving up on ownership when something is lost, right, is when an item is lost No one knows where it is. The owner certainly doesn't know where it is. And therefore we say, well, he's going to give up hope. He will eventually give up hope once he discovers that it's lost. But since he hasn't discovered that it's lost yet, we say that if you pick it up at that point, you can't acquire it because he doesn't know that it's lost yet. But in this case, the object isn't lost. The owner is still fully in possession of it. It's a known entity to him. And were he to discover that you were taking it, he would want you to take it. Not like a lost object where the owner wishes that no one would touch it. Here, the owner would want you to take his object. This is considered to be coming into the guest's hands in a permissible way, and therefore the Shach disagrees with Tosfos and the Rav Shulchan Aruch. And as the Makor Baruch says, "Umatzanu kama rishonim shekasvu lahedra kechila kashach." And there are many earlier commentaries who make this distinction in the exact same way as the Shach and disagree with Tosfos. And he quotes the Ritva and the Meiri, and therefore he says, "Al kain afal pisha lechatchila vada yesh lahachmir baza desafik doraisa lechumer Moshe Hisik Rabbeinu Hagon Hamachar b'shlita b'samuch mikol makam hamekel bazeh yesh lo ma lismoch." And therefore, we're going to see Rav Shirag is going to point to the fact that this is a machlokas rishonim. May I take someone's object without their knowledge if I know for sure they would want me to use it? He says there's going to be a machlokas. Tosfos would hold no. It's just like taking a lost object before the owner discovers it's lost. And according to the Shach and the Ritva and the Meiri, it is permissible. Rav Shiraga says because it's a machlokas, you should be machmir, because there may be an isser de oraisa here of gezel. Those are the stakes. And whenever there's an isser de oraisa and there's a suffix, whether it's an isser or not, we say suffix de oraisa lechumra. You have to be machmir. So it's on that basis that Rav Shiraga later on is going to tell us to be machmir. But if a person wishes to be mekel, yesh lo al ma lismoch, he has what to rely on. We're not going to go into the full footnote now. Let's just see the rest of it. V'lochein lahalacha, kevin sheyesh machlokas bedavar. And so therefore Rav Shiraga writes, since there's a big machlokas on this, lechatchila lo yishtamish bechefet shel chaver lo reshuso, then lechatchila, I advise people, don't take it without his permission. Since it's a bona fide suffix. Okay.
So what happens if there's a precedent, like 6 months before that, the owner allowed him to eat the food, and they go back 6 months later without him permission to do it?
Right. So if there's a precedent, then there's even more reason to be lenient if you know that the owner has basically said, yeah, for sure, anytime. But he really has to say anytime. Let's say, the owner pulls out an expensive bottle of schnapps, right? So you know that he doesn't mind sharing it with you, but maybe he only did it because it was a special occasion on that one off, because he wanted to impress you.
I wouldn't use Choshen example. That's too emotional. But
Right. Yeah, it's true because people have very expensive collections, right?
So that's not makel either. Then,
well, it depends. It depends on the context. If a guy has a relatively inexpensive commodity, and you know that his personality is such that he's happy to share it with everybody. So, and he's already made it clear to his friends. Just tell everyone who wants to come in, they're always welcome to come and take. So then you know that he wants people to take. Like I know, for example, there's we're coming up to Sukkot. So we have, people grow these not hadassim, arava bushes, yeah, and they have them in their backyard, right? So, if you know that there's a guy in your neighborhood who for years has been letting people come into his backyard and clip his aravas, so then you don't have to ask permission every single year. Can I come and clip aravas? But what if you told the guy, I'd like to come in, do you have any spare aravas? And the guy says, sure. I happen to have some spares because I've already cut for myself and my family, and whatever's left on the tree, you're welcome to. Just help yourself. Well, that's already not so clear, because he made a statement saying, I've already clipped the ones that I need for myself and my kids. Does that mean that I now have a carte blanche to go in anytime I want to take his aravos? It's now before the next year's sukkahs. I can't assume that he's already clipped the aravos that he wants for himself and his family. It seems like I'd have to ask him each time. So you have to, think about this very carefully. Just because he has a track record of doing it in the past, under what circumstances does he have a track record of doing it in the past? Okay. Just read a couple of lines from the footnote, and then we'll be finished for today. He says, Ela diyesh ladun dihine kol masha kosva atoisvus lesser hu b'chi agavin sha'ochel hasaperos umotzi osamin holim. There's a very important distinction to be made in the cases that we've been discussing. In one case, you're consuming the guy's produce. But the question here was to borrow someone's property and not consume it. Can I borrow your pen? Right? I'm just going to write with it for a couple of minutes. It's not like I'm consuming your pen, because it'll still be your pen afterwards. And the minuscule amount of ink that I've used is not going to diminish the value of the pen in any way. Here you're just borrowing an item. You're not consuming it. Maybe even Tosfos would agree that it's okay in this case. Because Tosfos's whole argument is the guy's relinquishing ownership of the item because he knows it's going to be consumed by somebody else. But maybe mashenkin b'shimush bulvad. But what if someone's just using it and allowing the person to retain ownership of it and not consuming it? Lo tzarech lahagia l'dinei yesh kedei lahatir lo. So maybe Tosfos's requirements are not as stringent as they would be for a case where a guy's eating the guy's produce, like in the case of the Gemara. So maybe borrowing something instead of eating something of someone else's or drinking a scotch is a totally different thing. So he says, "Umatzana b'shulchan aruch harav shekasav b'din shol shalom midas, di'im yodeya b'beirur she'ena balabayis makbid b'davar, mutar lihishtamesh bo." Even the Shulchan Aruch Harav, who sides with Tosfos, agrees that if you know for sure that the balabayis doesn't care that people borrow his item, then you're allowed to use it. Ubir sham b'kuntras acharon. And as the commentary known as the Kuntras Acharon writes, that's true because you're not consuming the item. The item is still intact. If I'm borrowing your sefer, right, without asking you permission, it's because I'm not destroying the sefer. I'm not in any way removing its existence from the world by my reading the book. So it's even the Shulchan Aruch Harav is permissive. V'chein mashma b'gemara gabe sefer Torah mahu detema ayin sham ad kam l'shonu b'tzarot bir kavanasa. So there's a Gemara that implies the same thing, that for a sefer Torah that is left for safekeeping that we saw the other day, that you're allowed to read from that sefer Torah if you're a Talmud Chacham, because you're allowed to assume that the owner would want you to read from it. V'nira deratza lahavi raya lazem mehad deisa bebav l'metzia, da'asr l'shoal sefer Torah lahashilu la'acher, v'shoala hagemara, harei kol shoal asr lahashil, v'tirtza mahu detema nichale le'inish lemevad mitzvah b'mamoni u'motor kamashman da'filu hachi asr. The Gemara does say that if you borrow a sefer Torah, you're not allowed to lend it to somebody else. And the Gemara says, well, isn't that obvious? You're never allowed to lend someone else's property without their permission. So the Gemara says, you might have thought that because people want a mitzvah to be done with their property, that a person would be happy to lend the sefer Torah to somebody else. So kamash malan, that nonetheless it's asr. Va'ayin lahamalbim b'sefer artzos hachayim, shehiksha al hagemara hanal. The gamim hayanicha le'inish lahashal et sefer Torah la'acher, harei sof sof hayiviyeyu shalom midas k'moshe kasvu ataisus hanal. So the Malbim also points out that even if a person would want to lend out their sefer Torah because it's a mitzvah, isn't there going to be a problem with he didn't have knowledge to relinquish ownership? Because of the mikan raya lichor ledas hashach the mutar b'chiyah gavna shaba'olam hayu misratzim, and the Malbim ends up saying, you see from here, from this Gemara, that the shach is correct, not like Tosfos, that in a situation where the owner would want other people to use it, you are allowed to lend it out. However, you are allowed to use it, but you can't lend it out to others. The nearer the bazeh hiskasha shulchan aruch hanal, umizeh huchiach diyesh lechalek the b'makom shurak mishnamish b'chayfetz v'lo mechaleu kmo b'sefer Torah chedome gam b'tosis yoda demuter b'chiyah gavna uvazem yusheves chushas ha'artzos hachayim al hatosis. So the bottom line is that you see from here that there is a distinction between borrowing something and consuming it. And so therefore, the footnote is much more lenient when it comes to borrowing than Rav Sharaga is. Okay, we'll hold it here because we're over time. So bottom line, we'll do